This episode is supported by Eurochild.
What are children's realities in Europe? Read Eurochild's Progress and Gaps report, examining the state of poverty, social exclusion and governmental efforts in 31 countries, and see what can be done to respect, protect and fulfil children's rights.
Today in the EU, can the EU help Ukraine as North Korea sends troops to Russia?
The war continues raging. Ukrainian people need more support. We have to provide this support, stop discussing and start acting quicker.
Mentioned EU's High Representative Josep Borrell before the initiation of the Foreign Affairs Council. Today marks 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The recent deployment of North Korean troops to Russia's Kursk region, entered by Ukrainian forces in August, signals a major shift in the conflict. North Korea's involvement, previously seen in arms supplies and meetings between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, now includes sending troops to the border. This move provides Russia with added manpower, posing greater challenges for Ukraine's trained military resources and increasing its need for ammunition. The effectiveness of North Korean troops is uncertain due to their limited combat experience. However, EU ministers are concerned but limited in action due to North Korea's isolation as they gather in Brussels amid pressure to strengthen military support, especially with future US aid uncertain. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori and this is Today in the EU. To look into this topic, I'm joined by Security and Defense editor Aurélie Pugnette. Hi Aurélie.
Hi Evi.
So on Monday last week, North Korea deployed troops in Kursk, the region Ukrainians have entered in Russia. How important is this development for the future of Ukraine in this invasion?
So it's a very important development because obviously we know that North Korea has been helping Russia in its war against Ukraine. And there had been deliveries of missiles, and we have seen a few meetings between Putin and Kim Jong-un together, showing very happy faces about their friendship or relationship. I don't really know how we can call it, bromance. Definitely a good business relationship. So yes, the North Korean troops in Russia are quite an important development because they would give the Russians extra resources, extra humans, extra people to keep on fighting against the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are already struggling with the little troops they have and the few men that they actually have to fight against the Russians. So if their enemy is amassing more soldiers and has even more of that advantage, it will definitely be more difficult for the Ukrainians to fight back. And even if Russia is using those people as just flesh to just throw in the conflict, even if they don't last long, it's still more people that the Ukrainians have to kill. It's still more ammunition that the Ukrainians have to use, more missiles, more everything.
Right. And what numbers are we talking about? What will they do on the front lines?
So what the US officials have been saying is that those North Korean troops joining Russia are around 80,000. It's a lot of people to kill for the Ukrainians.
Indeed.
It is, one could also say, a lot of people for the Russians to train because North Koreans have not been actively involved into a conflict. It's obviously a country that is taking its security very seriously, that is producing a lot of weapons, we see a lot of ballistic missiles tests at the moment, but it's not a country that is in the trenches. So we might assume that it is training involved. What is interesting to think about is that the North Koreans, as far as we know, positioned in the Kursk region, as you said earlier. And that is the bordering region of Russia to Ukraine. And this is also the region which the Ukrainians entered back in August. And this is the region where Russia is amassing a lot of stockpiles to then fight in Ukraine. So there's a lot of, ammunition and other types of weapons. And the latest decision by the US to allow the Ukrainians to strike deep into Russia, that could actually allow the Ukrainians to use those weapons, use their missiles to go far into the Kursk region and possibly target those stockpiles. But also, it means North Koreans and maybe training camps or wherever they are positioned in the region.
Now, coming a bit closer to our territory, EU ministers of foreign affairs are meeting this week to address the latest developments in Ukraine, with a specific focus on defense today. What's their take on the involvement of North Korea in the conflict right now?
So obviously they're very worried about it. We've heard a few countries already saying that it brings concern, that obviously it is not a good thing for several reasons. One is that they say Russia partnering with a country like North Korea, which is completely isolated on the world stage, that is the subject of so many sanctions, so many embargoes, that is really on the side of everything that is happening in the world. Obviously, there is a horrible look on Russia. And so they say, in a way, it shows that the isolation by the West of Russia is working. And it shows that they have no other solution than to partner with North Korea, Iran, China to a certain extent.
Дзвінок Олафа, на мою думку, це скринька Пандори. Тепер можуть бути і інші розмови, інші дзвінки.
Olaf's call, in my opinion, opens Pandora's box. There may be other conversations, just a lot of wars. This is exactly what Putin has long wanted. It is extremely important for him to reduce his isolation and to engage in negotiations. That will lead to nothing, said President Volodymyr Zelensky on social media last Friday.
The other thing is that they are concerned because we don't know what North Korea has. North Korea being incredibly isolated and a very closed-off country, this means that we don't know what they have in terms of troops. We don't know how equipped they are. We don't know how much weapons they can give the Russians to use on a battlefield. And we don't know what is their production capacity. So we don't know how long they can sustain or help Russia sustain the war. So obviously it brings a lot of concern, and the EU ministers would like to discuss it. They want to discuss it especially with South Korea, which is obviously the neighbor of North Korea, they have a lot of experience dealing with them. But the problem is that the EU can't really do anything. Then we come to the sore point, or the main issue about the EU foreign policy here is that you can put on sanctions on people, on companies, or on people that are part of a state apparatus for people that you want them to change their behavior, right? Where you can still hope that, Vladimir Putin will one day wake up and change his behavior, and then maybe we'll lift sanctions. But the thing is, with North Korea, it's too late. I mean, the chances of North Korea changing any of its behavior when it comes to war behavior, it's completely unimaginable at this stage. And the EU putting more sanctions, you can always put more sanctions on companies and on Kim Jong-un if you want, but what is it going to change really at the end of the day? Probably nothing. So this is where they are.
We will get back to this after the ad.
Children face many challenges in Europe, including inadequate mental health services and insufficient investment in the early years. We need to remove these gaps for a fairer present and future for all children. Read Eurochal's latest report, Children's Realities in Europe.
So, Aurélie, continuing on this, would you say that this is yet another wake-up call for European leaders to strengthen military aid to Ukraine, especially on the backdrop of the Trump administration that will take office in January?
I would assume it is, or from what I understand, when I talk with diplomats and people that are involved in those discussions, it's obviously an extra stress on the EU's capacity and the Europeans' capacity in supporting Ukraine militarily. The production capacity of the Europeans and the Americans, for example, has stepped up over the past years, so they can produce a lot more than they used to. For example, I was hearing last week that I think they can produce now 3 million rounds of ammunition a year, and that is about the same as Russia. When before the war, it was 1 million to 3, so actually they have stepped up. But the North Koreans or whatever other country that could send more troops, here in Europe or in the US, there is absolutely no appetite in sending their own troops, in sending Western troops on the ground with the Ukrainians fighting against the Russians at this point. So it's a huge difference in how they see a conflict. One side is working basically on industrial capacity and on high technology and things like this to fight the Russians, whereas on the other side, it's about how many men can I put on the battlefield and how many rounds of ammunition can I fire and how can I destroy completely the energy system, for example, of Ukraine to just completely demoralize them and completely bring them to their knees.
And Ukrainian President Zelensky is also speaking before the European Parliament today On top of the ministers' defense talks, is there any EU plan to channel more military aid to Ukraine in the short term?
If there isn't one, there should be one, because obviously with the Americans changing administration, so Donald Trump is coming back to the White House, it's not a secret that the Republicans have been quite careful when it comes to sending military aid and military support to Ukraine. So it's a bit unclear how the American support will go on for the next months, starting January, if not even before. So the Europeans will have to give a lot of whatever they produce, whatever they buy, whatever they get from anywhere around the world. So it's going to put an extra strain on their capacity to produce and on their stockpiles. So there is always a plan to do more pledging and promising more deliveries. But then the problem is, a lot of people say, and the Ukrainians say themselves, is that there's a huge difference between what is actually promised and what actually arrives on the ground, or if it does arrive, is how long it takes to get there. And yes, there are logistical issues. You can't just send weapons via plane and just land it right here on the front line and unload, give it to troops, here we go. But they have been saying that they want to find better ways to make that work, and they also just really want people to keep their promise, because you can promise as much as you want, but if you never actually deliver the air defense system, that does create a problem for the Ukrainians.
Based on everything that we've discussed so far, I am really wondering, who is leading the way on defense in the EU right now? We see in Germany there is a political crisis now with Scholz awaiting general elections in February, and Macron seems quite weakened, and his government as well. So what's happening?
It's a good question. It's interesting that you think, that you would say that France or Germany would be the ones leading. I think, on the contrary, the war has shown that countries in the east and the north of Europe have taken quite a large share in the responsibility in leading. We've seen Estonia leading massively.
Nic o Ukrainie bez Ukrainy. Podjąłem już wysiłki, żeby mobilizować premierów.
Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. I have taken effort to mobilize prime ministers and presidents of member states to make it an ironclad principle, said Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk in a joint press conference with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
We've seen Poland leading massively. We've seen other countries maybe in NATO as well, like Romania, for example, that has seen several times missile pieces falling onto its territory, has been quite stern in answering and being also delivering a lot of its defense systems to Ukraine. For example, Romania at some point had zero defense system because they gave everything to Ukrainians. So maybe we shouldn't think so much in terms of who are the traditional supporters or the traditional leaders in Europe, but rather who is actually giving a lot and who is actually coming up with new ideas for support. Like, for example, we can also talk about the Czechs that created a whole initiative to also deliver ammunition to the Ukrainians where it wasn't linked to the EU budget. So yes, it doesn't have this whole of the EU approach and this whole unity approach, but at the end of the day, what matters is also, do the weapons actually get to the front line? And are those weapons actually the ones that Ukraine needs? So maybe this is what we should be looking at.
Well, thank you very much, Aurélie.
Thank you, Evie, for having me again.
I am Evie Chiori, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sainz Tejada, Charles Cohen, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.